Welcome to Precious Pursuit Radio. I'm your host, Jeremy DePanger, and I'm so glad you could join me today. Every episode of our show has a single goal: to discover objective truth with boldness and grace. Before we get started, I want to issue my first of two reminders for this episode that if you find this content interesting, edifying, or otherwise entertaining, please like, share, subscribe, leave a review, or all of the above, and don't forget to turn on your notifications on YouTube so that you know not only when I go live, but also when I post videos after the fact. So tonight's episode is a live recording. And whenever we go live, you can always join us on YouTube. And if you're unable to join live and want to watch or listen after the fact, you can check out new and old episodes on my YouTube channel, Anchor FM, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. Just search for Precious Pursuit Radio and you'll find the latest episode right there at the top. For those of you that like to watch or listen on Google Podcasts, sometimes the episodes take 2 to 3 days to process. I don't know why it's so slow, but just hang tight if you want to listen to it there. I'd recommend going to Apple Podcasts if you're eager to listen to it sooner, or just coming to my YouTube channel, since the video will go immediately into the playlist after we're done with the live recording. So quick comment about the chat. YouTube live chat is on, so feel free to comment, leave comments or questions to engage in the discussion tonight. And with that out of the way, let's jump right into our topic for tonight, and that is reliable sources. So as you can tell from the previous two episodes that we've done, we're kind of on a little bit of a theme right now. We've been talking about, in episode 1, we talked about the breakdown of discourse. We talked about all the sorts of things that are going wrong with communication over the internet, with social media, with buzz phrases, and the inability to create actual arguments or formulate coherent thoughts. And last week, we also talked about logical fallacies. So we got kind of dove into some detail on various common ways in which we see logical fallacies online and how we can combat them, how we can think about them, and how we can do better if we have fallen to some of those traps ourselves. So tonight's episode is on reliable sources, and I intend the episode tonight to be fairly general as we look at what the different types of sources are, how to establish whether a source is credible / reliable. And then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about how to reduce our own biases, how we can assess the way that we're interacting with information, and what methods we use to determine what sources we lean on and whether or not those are in fact good practices, good habits, or if we should maybe break some of those and establish better habits for finding sources of information. So that's kind of the big picture of the episode tonight. But I will say that sources and biases and information, they always matter. But tonight, we're going to be mainly focused on sources in the context of internet communication or internet research, since that's where a lot of people get their information, and nowadays anyway, and that's how a lot of people engage in their communication with either strangers or people that they know. If you're doing, book research, you go into a library. If you're doing other kind of research, all of that matters, and a lot of the stuff we're going to be talking about tonight is relevant to that. But keeping along with the theme of internet and social media, I wanted to kind of emphasize the importance of reliable sources on the internet. As we know, the internet has a lot of information on it, not always good information. There's a lot of bad information on the internet in addition to good information. So hopefully by the end of today's episode, you'll feel a little more comfortable navigating the choppy waters of trying to find credible, reliable sources. And hopefully that will lead you to better information, more truthful information, more established facts that you can use in your own discussions, in your own arguments, and in order to formulate your own thoughts on important issues. So let's go ahead and dive right into our first section, which is just to talk about the types of sources that exist. The first type, there's really three types of sources. There's primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. And I'll define what each of them are, and then in the next section, we'll kind of get to why this matters. So a primary source is the original material. So examples of this would be journal articles, dissertations, like a thesis, like a PhD thesis, interviews, autobiographies, things of that nature. These are sources that deal directly with either the person or the information or the topic that's at hand. So, for example, if you're doing PhD research on, I'll just say my master's thesis was on basically an automated stair crawler for people with disabilities, elderly and disabled folks. And so I actually built a prototype of it. It was a car battery powered 4-leg robotic cart, essentially like a sort of like a wheelchair, like a powered wheelchair that could climb stairs. And in that work that I did in my master's thesis, I had to do my own build, my own calculations, find my own materials, do my own research. And so that would be an example of primary material because I dealt directly firsthand with the topic, with the study, with the engineering project. So that's primary source. That's a primary source. A secondary source is analysis or restatement of a primary source. So this would be, for example, a textbook would be a secondary source, a biography, political analyses and commentaries. Those are secondary sources, right? Because they're not creating information. They're not the origin of the information. They are taking the information secondhand and doing something with it. So like a textbook would take research that someone else did, say a physics textbook, would take research that someone else did in a thesis, in a laboratory, and then they're repackaging it and explaining it and discussing it and expanding on it. Same thing with political analyses. If you were to turn on CNN or Fox News or MSNBC, all of which I would advise you not to do. I don't like watching the news for all the reasons that I've discussed in the past couple episodes. But if you are the kind of person that likes to turn on the TV and watch news at night or in the morning, the commentators there are oftentimes engaging at their secondary sources of information. Then the third and final type of source is tertiary. So the tertiary source is really just a list or repackaging of primary or secondary sources. So this would be Wikipedia, handbooks, almanacs, sources that really just a tertiary source really just takes information and organizes it or lists it out. So if you go to Wikipedia, for example, and you search for, I don't know, the city of, or the Capitol building, for example, and you want to learn about the Capitol building, you can go to the Wikipedia page and there will be a list of information about the Capitol building, but there's not going to be much by way of commentary on it. Wikipedia is not engaged in directly actual like fact finding or doing the research needed in order to say what the Capitol building is, how it was constructed, its history, all of that. That was done by a primary source. And then it spills over into a tertiary source like Wikipedia. So also, like I said, handbooks, almanacs, which are really just listing out information. those would be examples of tertiary sources. So you'll notice the trend here that the primary source is the closest to the original information, and the tertiary source is furthest away. So one thing that we can do as we look at the types of information we consume is to try to identify what is the source of the information that we're looking at. Is it primary? Is it secondary? Or is it tertiary? And the further we get from the primary, the more careful we need to be in terms of our trust of that information, because every step that you are removed, you have opinions inserted, you have analysis inserted, you have repackaging of those things inserted by people that may be trustworthy, right? So you don't just discount it automatically. It may be trustworthy, but it also may not be, for reasons that we'll talk about a little bit later, how to establish credibility. So the further we get from a primary source, the more careful we need to be with the information that we're looking at or discussing, especially if we're trying to form a view on something, or we actually need that information for something. We need to be careful the further we go from a primary source. Okay, so that defines for us what the types of sources are. So let's go to our next section, which is source credibility or reliability. One of the reasons why being able to determine whether a source is credible or reliable is important is because in our day and age, it's always been important to find truth, to establish truth. But in our day and age, especially with the availability of the internet, social media, no accountability for anything that anyone says, there's a greater need to filter through a larger volume of information than we have ever had to do before. The internet is literally a fire hose of information, a lot of it bad, incorrect, and misleading. And we have to have special, very strong, robust filters applied to that fire hose in order to make sure that we don't drown in bad information. So we see this on social media all the time. It's just today, I can be scrolling through, I was scrolling through Twitter and I see memes of people talking about the immigrants that were moved from Texas to New York City. And that, which is obviously a hot button political issue. And we're not here tonight to discuss that issue in particular, but it's so polarizing that you have to be, I just, when I look at a meme, I immediately discard it, because a meme is at best, it's a secondary source, and it's almost always done with some kind of motivation in mind. So we have to, like, when I'm looking at a meme of an important issue like that, sometimes memes are just funny, right? And you take them for what they are. But if someone, all the time in Twitter, you'll be scrolling through a thread and you'll see someone will post something that is a legitimate argument about an issue, like say they shouldn't be busing immigrants to New York City or something like that. They'll make a claim like that, and then someone will reply with a meme. So instead of actually engaging the person with an argument, they think that the meme is actually a valid substitute for an original logical thought. And a lot of times people will take the cleverness, the wittiness of the meme, and they'll buy into it, and they'll either be so entrenched on that side of the fence that they'll just accept whatever that meme is saying as being true, or they'll actually be persuaded by it because it's witty and clever. So we have to be careful. That's just one example, but there's so many of them, so many examples of social media information, memes, regurgitated statements, buzz phrases, political political coloring of information. We have to be really careful with how we absorb information. So my hope is that by the end of this episode tonight, that people will feel more comfortable navigating your own social media feeds, whether you're on Twitter or not, Facebook, reading the news online, watching it on TV, having discussions with people, that you'll be able to identify some of the ways that information can be corrupted because the sources are not credible. So how do we navigate that? What are the tools we can use? Well, there's a fairly standard test that's used, and the acronym is CRAAP, which, if I'm going to put it up on the screen here, we're going to pretend like that the actual way that looks like it would be pronounced is not the way that it's pronounced. I'm going to call it the Crepe Test. And the reason I'm going to call it the Crepe Test is because crepes are tempting and sweet, but I need to check myself to make sure that I'm not going to eat it or eat too much of it for my own health. So think about it. Maybe that'll help you think about it in terms of applying this test to information you see. The Crepe Test. Hey, that information, it looks right. Maybe it's right. It looks persuasive, but is it really? Is this true? Is it right? So there's five letters in that CRAAP. So there's 5 different prongs to this test. The first prong is the source current, or is the information current? So look at when the information was published or posted. Has the information been revised or updated? Right? If you looked at an article from 2020 on, say, the status of the economy, like on inflation, for example, and you are so excited because inflation looks great in 2020, but you think it's a current source, meaning that you think it was written yesterday, then you're going to walk away with an incorrect picture of the state of inflation in our country. So check the dates. Is it current? That's the primary aspect of this prong is it current, and has it been updated? The second prong is relevance. Is the information, how important is the information for your needs? So does the information relate to your topic or answer your question? Who is the intended audience for the information? Is the information at an appropriate level? Is it, not too elementary or too advanced for what you need? Have you looked at a variety of sources before determining that this is the one that you'll use? And would you be comfortable using this source for, say, like a research paper, or quoting it to someone that that you trust, that you want to give reliable information to? Is it would you be comfortable doing that? So the third prong of the test is authority. So this one matters a lot. But it also has been somewhat skewed, I would say, in today's thinking. So we have to be very careful, because authority intrinsically doesn't mean that the source of the information is... If your source is authoritative, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good source. It's a good source when the other 4 things are also true. So on its own, no, not necessarily, but packaged with these other 4 things, yes. So for the authority, it's first identify who is the author of the material, the publisher, the source, the sponsor, whatever it is. Who is the actual author? First identify it. If you're reading an article, try to identify who wrote the article, or if the article is quoting someone, find out who was being quoted. And if you can, go one step further and do your own research to find out whether or not the quote that was given is the full quote, if it was misquoted, or if it was quoted out of context. That's the next step you can do. But as far as the author, check to see who the author was, who wrote it, who said it. What are the author's credentials? What are their affiliations? Are they affiliated with an organization? What does that organization do? What do they believe in? What are they trying to accomplish? What are the author's credentials? So what are they known for? What is their title? What do they do? What do they know? And then is there a way to contact this person? Is there a way to cross-check with this person that they actually said what they wrote, or if they were maybe misquoted? Like, for example, if you read an article where someone was quoted saying something crazy, is there a way to reach out to that person to see if that was actually true, if that quote is correct? Both the author of the article as well as the person that said the quote that sounded crazy. Oftentimes you won't get that, right? Oftentimes you won't just be able to get someone's email address, but sometimes you can, and that's a good way to try to verify if the information is correct. And so you just look into all of those things, right? Identify the author, figure out their credentials, what organizations may they be associated with, and what are that author's qualifications to be speaking on the topic that they're talking on. Now, I'll pause for a moment here because I said at the beginning when I started talking about authority that this has been a little bit, the importance of this number 3 has been skewed a little bit in today's thinking. The reason I say that is because when we talk about whether someone's qualified to speak on something, there are certain topics that are so advanced that we rely on people with expert information to give us correct information in order to create a viewpoint, to establish policy, etc. Even then, though, we still have to be careful because oftentimes people that do have valuable information, right, they're human just like us. They have motivations just like us. They have biases just like us. So we have to always be careful that just because someone is very knowledgeable in a certain area, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're a good source. They could be lying. They could be misrepresenting information. They could say something that's just flatly illogical, right? Sometimes you can just read something someone says or listen to something someone says, and you can tell right away something's wrong. Something seems fishy about it because it's not consistent. It's not logical. It doesn't pass the common sense test. We see that a lot from politicians that claim to be experts on certain things. We see that in expert witnesses in trials. We see that, frankly, all over the place. It's unfortunate. It makes our job harder when we're talking about trying to identify truth, but it's very important to do. But the importance of number 3 is to say that if we've identified someone that is knowledgeable, we're likely to be closer to having good information on that issue than we are from someone that doesn't have any expertise, right? So if, for example, if I want to learn about physics and I want to learn more about gravity, I'm not going to seek out a philosophy major or an art major, someone that has a PhD in communications to tell me about gravity. I'm going to seek out someone that has a PhD in physics, that knows about gravity, that's familiar with the equations, that can actually speak with some level of knowledge on that topic. Now, they still could be giving me false information, but at least I'm likely to be closer to true information if I'm seeking someone that is an authority on that topic. Okay, so number 4 of the Crepe Test is accuracy. So this is where we have to couple this with number 3 to say, where does the information come from? Is the information supported by evidence? Has the information been reviewed? oftentimes we hear the term peer review. So when a journal article is published, has that article been peer reviewed, meaning other people with similar expertise, have they looked at it and scrutinized it, provided criticism and thoughts on the issue? Can you verify that any of the information is, if there's another source for it, or if this is just someone's personal knowledge? Does the language seem biased? Is it free of emotion? Or one way to find that out is to try to identify loaded phrases or loaded words, adjectives or adverbs that describe certain things. So, like, for example, if someone was writing an article about the President Joe Biden, and they said that, and they were to lead off by saying, the President Joe Biden wants to enact this policy. We've seen time and time again from his corruption that he wants to achieve XYZ. Okay, well, right there we can see that this person just used the adjective corrupt to describe Joe Biden. So obviously there's a bias there that they think that Joe Biden is corrupt. So right away we need to question that source. Now, he may in fact be corrupt, right? Like that's possible. And it's possible for any time that word is used to describe someone that it's possibly true. But when someone that's supposed to be speaking with logic, with evidence, with reason, uses loaded language like that, we immediately have to question it. That's a red flag. So the last prong of this test is purpose. What is the purpose that the source produced this information? Was it to inform? Was it to teach? Was it to sell you something? Was it to entertain? Was it to try to persuade you of a viewpoint? Do the authors or does the source make their intention clear? Do they say up front what they're trying to do? Or is it hidden? Do they not tell you? Is the information that they're providing, is it facts? Is it opinion? Propaganda? What's the viewpoint? Does it seem objective, or does it seem partial to something? And then always there's some common ways in which people let biases slip in: political, ideological, cultural, religious, institutional, personal biases. These are all things that can slip into our communication quite easily. And by just reading and rereading or listening and re-listening to what people say, we're able to identify those sorts of biases relatively quickly a lot of the time. Now, so that's the test. So these are 5 things that we should always use when we're trying to establish whether or not a source of information is credible. That being said, the source may not always have all 5 of these things, or it may not always be easy to tell if the source has all 5 of these things. That may be okay. What I would say is, depending on the importance of the information that you're seeking, so on a scale of 1 to 10, if the information that you're seeking has a 1 level of importance, it probably doesn't need to have all 5 of these prongs passed. If it has 3 of the 5 and there's no red flags, you're probably good to go. If the information that you're trying to seek is a 10, as in it really matters that you get this right, you got to have all 5 of these. You got to be sure that the source is good and that you have multiple sources that are good, that both pass, or 2, 3, 4 sources that pass this test. Okay, so we've talked about the types of sources: primary, secondary, tertiary. We've used the Crepe Test to establish whether or not the source is reliable. So the last thing I want to do in today's episode, we're going to go a couple of minutes over, and that's fine, is to talk about what questions can we ask ourselves to figure out whether we're actually using good sources or not. What habits have we formed around information and our research and reading, listening to things? What sort of bad habits might we have that we should kick, and what sort of good habits should we form to get better, more truthful, more accurate information? So there's a list of 4 questions that I think we should ask ourselves when we're talking about trying to reduce our own biases and find good sources. The first question is common sources. What types of sources do I mainly lean on? What are my common sources of information? Do I get all of my information by going to CNN? Do I get all of my information from reading my favorite 2 or 3 people on Twitter or my favorite 2 or 3 people on Facebook? What common sources do you lean on? And are those sources primary, secondary, or tertiary? Are they close to the original information? Are they more likely to be at the source, at the origin, or are they far away from it? The second question to ask is source diversity. Do I lean heavily on one person or a handful of people for most of my information or guidance on something? It's almost always a good idea to have a diverse set of sources when you're trying to assess information, because for a couple of reasons. Number one, it gives you more confidence that the information that you discovered is true, which makes it easier to form a true, valid, reasonable viewpoint on something. But also because if you only use, say, 1 or 2 sources all the time, you may have entered into an echo chamber where there's no real accountability or anything pushing back on those views. You're just absorbing it. And over time, you may start to just believe the things that are being said simply because that person is saying it. There's implicit source bias. So if we have, say, 5 sources that we typically go to, if one of them is saying something untruthful, it's more likely that with 5 sources, you'll get the sources conflicting with each other, in which case you know then that you need to do additional research to find out if the claim is true or not, or the information is a fact or not, because they're conflicting. You would know one source can't conflict with itself. You would need multiple sources to be able to tell you that. The third question we should ask ourselves are source quality, right? What are my sources experts, unbiased, and error-free? Are they objective? Do they meet the Crepe Test that we went over earlier? Is the information current, relevant, authoritative, accurate, and what is the purpose? And that's the last question that we should ask is, what's the motivation? If you need to ask one question of a source, it's typically good to try to ask this first. If you can only ask one question about, let's say, an article that you read, ask, why is this person writing this article? What are they trying to communicate to me? Are they trying to persuade me of something, or are they just trying to give me information? News media in general, 20 years ago, had a greater percentage of just factual information being conveyed to its readers. Now, not all of it, there have always been opinion pieces. But now, if you go to a website like CNN or all the mainstream news sites, they are loaded with opinion pieces. There are very few articles that you can find now that don't have some sort of tilt or bias or thing that they're trying to persuade you of. Sometimes a nakedly clear viewpoint on something. Sometimes it's masked better than others. And for that reason, it's all the more important for us to ask, why did the person write this? What was their purpose for trying to give me this information? And if when you ask yourself that question, and anything seems fishy about it, then go find another source. Go look for something that seems more objective. That actually tells you why they're writing what they're writing. It isn't necessarily a bad thing to read something that's trying to persuade you, right? There may be, like, for example, a philosophical paper that may be trying to convince you that God exists, or that a certain thing is moral or immoral to do. And it's totally fine for people to write persuasive pieces. But you should know that that's what they're trying to do. Don't just get swept up in the first thing that you read. Understand the motivation. Understand that the person has a bias, they have a purpose for communicating with you, and then engage what they have to say and see if it meets these other qualifications. Like currency, is it relevant, authoritative, accurate, etc. So I hope that these 4 questions help us to reduce our own biases when it comes to information, as well as seeking sources of information. And that the next time that we encounter an article, a blog post, something on Facebook, something on TV news, whatever it is, that we're able to ask ourselves some of these basic questions, that we remember to do that, and we're able to better identify what makes a good source, what makes a bad source, and that we can all just end up with better information. Because ultimately, more people with more accurate information leads to more discussion, more reasoning, more productive debate on issues, and it gets us closer to the truth than if we just believe the first thing that we hear, if we don't check our sources at all, if we don't do any research to see whether the person that's speaking to us is trying to tell us the truth, or if they're simply just trying to get us to believe something. So that about wraps it up for our discussion tonight on reliable sources. That was episode 3. Please leave your thoughts and feedback in the comments below, and I will try to do my best to respond to them this week. A special thanks to the folks who were able to join us live. I appreciate that always. If you missed the live discussion, you can always watch or listen after the fact here on my YouTube channel, Anchor FM, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. And drop a like and tell a friend if you enjoyed the content tonight. Don't forget to turn on your notifications for next week's episode, and feel free to dig back into any of the old episodes and provide comments there too. I'm always open to rehashing discussions on old content. To me, it's never old. It's always current. So thanks again. And until next time, God bless.